Welcome to this massive open online course on urbanization in Africa. It's wonderful to have your expertise and that of Asiye Edafuleni. Can I just invite you to introduce yourself and to explain who you are and what your contribution will be?
My name is Richard Dobson. I'm an architect by training. Our topic is about urban informality, particularly informal work and urban infrastructure. If we look at the context which we'll be talking about, which is Warwick Junction, as it's known, Durban, South Africa, the work started as a post-apartheid initiative, which was trying to sew a divided city back together again, started in '96. And from the images that you can see, the urban infrastructure work that the city embarked upon, which was to enable informal work in public spaces, the biggest impact clearly are the road network. But if you start looking at the next layer of detail, it is very obvious that the area has been substantially changed with the benefication that has arisen from work on work which has benefited informal workers. And that, in fact, has been both at a detailed level. It's been through interventions, boldly putting in new walkways, which had connected disrupted walkways, remembering that in the apartheid years, people who arrived at the public transport node would, and if they weren't white, they wouldn't have been able to enter the city without first crossing the rail corridor, which effectively was that barrier. If we start looking at some of the examples, and we'll look at three different screens, the first would be traditional herb and medicine. So deeply cultural for a huge number of people in South Africa. It's estimated that 80% of African people defer to traditional medicine as part of their health regimen, or certainly a cultural reference. So the intervention here was, this was on the sidewalk. It wasn't easy to be able to accommodate it in an already very busy area. And so I guess if it was an innovation, the innovation was to utilize the unutilized portion of the freeway network and to build a linear market. Secondly was and is the practice of cooking cow's heads, again, deeply cultural, a Zulu male tradition. And that happened and was occurring on the sidewalks. And with the externalities of that from an urban management point of view, clearly to dignify both the practice and to manage the urban management challenges, the creation of a dedicated facility that managed and dignified the process was clearly necessary. And then the work which we were engaged in was to redesign that market in its next iteration. And what's illustrated are the processes that we would have engaged in to do that. Next would be corn on the cob, or mealies as they refer to here in South Africa. Not your normal urban practice, but one that's hugely significant to local people, particularly from a food sovereignty and a food security point of view, but creating a space where this really robust cooking process could be accommodated. And then the last two images on that line, where sadly the market redeveloped by the city, but without consultation, and the pressure that was then exerted on the cooks was particularly heat and smoke loads. And so our intervention was at the finer detail to start to see if we could develop a fuel-efficient and appropriate alternate method of cooking the mealies. And then lastly, at a different level, I guess, which is probably very significant to many African towns and cities, is how do you start to reimagine and redevelop appropriated spaces, in this instance, a decommissioned roadway, hugely significant locally because it's a veneration site for a Muslim community. And so their intervention was to request of the city that a permanent roof be erected in that area. And that gave birth, as it were, to now this long linear market, probably 300 meters or so, where the urban space has really been changed at scale. The next level would probably be place. And so in the case of informal recyclers who generally use public spaces for the gathering and collecting and sorting of their material, is how could one provide infrastructure that created what we've described as a safe sidewalk, but in a way, once one does that, is to plug it into the city network so that it actually starts to have added value. And so in this particular instance, it was to plug it in alongside a public park. And then out of interest, it's known that a ton of cardboard saves 17 trees, so that became the theme of the park. The park actually has 17 trees. But then if we look at the second line, we have to be highly aware that we're talking about informal work, and so it is the workplace. And the workplace has realities. In this instance, the softer issues, how do parents raise their children in a working environment that is informal? How do you innovatively intervene and provide childcare right at the workplace in a congested environment with all the challenges about security, how you pack up at night? So our solution and intervention is what we're describing as a pop-up concept with infrastructure which enables that. And then we can look at probably, again, softer issues, but it's how do you professionalize, in this instance, informal recyclers again, but how do you provide appropriate conveyances? How do you provide workwear? And then lastly, probably place and places. So informal workers will locate themselves in the most optimal places in the city. So although those might not be optimal from a spatial point of view, the fact that they have chosen those locations, that needs to be acknowledged and valued. And so often the redesign and the provision of infrastructure needs to take deep cognizance of that and then start to incorporate that into the urban design challenge. And then lastly, the last image is just the sober image that you have to engage in very deep consultation and getting feedback from the stakeholders and the users. Otherwise, you end up with infrastructure which is totally inappropriate. And then, of course, the next layer would be the specifics and the detail. Yes, a progressive approach to how one might start to assimilate informality into the urban environment. It does start at what we call the entry level. And this must be highly valued because for many cities, towns, this is not even an opportunity. So simply a demarcated space on the sidewalk with a permit is absolutely invaluable. But then you can progress from that very kind of minimalist approach towards starting to incorporate that same idea, perhaps in the urban design detail, and then ultimately starting to develop some top-end urban design kind of appropriate responses. And in this instance, imagery from the Durban High Street, where informal workers have been incorporated into the urban aesthetic. How can you get clues from the streets and these two images? How can we, in time, start to move towards assimilating those practices into mainstream? How does one start to make all that happen? The first is very obviously doing field work. Principally in the field work, what you're really looking at is data gathering. You have to be deeply, deeply committed to observation. So unless you're going to really pick up the street clues, you're really not going to be able to adequately start to respond to some future design or an intervention. Very simply, those would definitely be what the urban impact is of that, both from what it looks like, the urban aesthetic, and then often, which is a requirement from local authority, are the urban management challenges which are emerging from that. The fieldwork is critical, how you record it. In our view, this idea of making it very graphic is very helpful because it allows you in the consultation process to be able to include everybody. And then the spatial activity and the spatial analysis, also critical, remembering that many of these spaces have been now appropriated in a different way to which they were originally intended. So looking at cross-section, for instance, of a street and how that has now been spatially rezoned effectively because of the way it's been utilized, starts to become critical to get a sense of where the use bias might start to settle. And then if you're going to make interventions, how you might make those recommendations. We would always challenge people to develop a contextually appropriate typology from what they're seeing, because ultimately those become the building blocks as you move forward to some sort of intervention or engaging with various stakeholders for an improved environment. We believe that empowering informal workers with knowledge that starts to level the playing field with when one enters meaningfully into consultation processes is critical. And these are two examples of work we've done. We're now seeing the wash stations being reappropriated, for instance, fruit sellers who are selling fruit and having wash stations on their sites to be able to sell their fruit individually, and people can wash them straight away. Bovine head cooks using them for health and hygiene in terms of their food preparation. It really does assemble the building blocks that we have tried to discuss earlier. And so the first would be to put together your matrix about what one has been able to gather from the site. And you can see you're developing the typologies, trying to get imagery which illustrates those typologies, and then how one might actually take them through into a formal replanning exercise. And then clearly one uses the tools available in the built environment professions to start to illustrate those, so that at an early stage you have material that you can use in a consultation process. To conclude, certainly within South Africa, we believe there's planning legislation which could allow us to really be proactive in this whole approach. And it sits within what's known as SPLUMA. That's the Spatial Planning Land Use Management Act. And that allows for what they call overlays. So the common ones here in South Africa, which most people would recognize, would be historic precincts, metropolitan public open space, green zones, which are going to be preserved. But we believe in a similar way, one could have a public space overlay. And one of the predicators of generating those overlays is that they have to be highly consultative. They have to engage with all the stakeholders who would be involved in that decision making. So thank you very much.